Hello, welcome to our Math 101 final project presentation on COVID-19 cases, deaths, and regulations on a national and global scale. So we used a funnel approach. We went from very general to very specific. We went both national with the 50 states and international by choosing 10 overall countries. So overall, we did monthly number of cases and deaths per 100,000 people. So this here is us using the z-score by showing the states that were above our mean, meaning they did worse compared to other states, and then in the blue to the left, the ones who did better. This is the formula to find z-score, as well as a graph to kind of show how z-score is used. So as far as national results, here are the top 10 and bottom states. The top graph shows the top 10 and bottom 10 for COVID-19 cases, and the graph below that shows the deaths. As you can see, we have on the left, the blue, these cases, the farther they are from the middle, the better they did compared to states as far as their proportion goes. And then the red on the right shows the worst they did. So we have North Dakota at the top being the worst in cases, and Vermont at the bottom as the best as far as their proportion for cases, as well as New Jersey at the top being the worst in deaths, and the Vermont still at the bottom as in deaths proportion.
We can see a really stark contrast when comparing the states of North Dakota and Vermont. As you can tell, in North Dakota, from the months of April through November, cases were rising very steeply, whereas in Vermont, those numbers remained pretty low. In North Dakota, in March, international travelers were required to quarantine for 2 weeks upon return, whereas in Vermont, that actually was applied to all residents and non-residents. The state of emergency was declared in Vermont. Non-essential businesses closed and schools were closed for 2 weeks and then indefinitely. North Dakota had a similar approach, except they were only planning on closing schools for 1 week initially. Looking from April to July, we see that North Dakota actually began a phased reopening in April, which seemed pretty early because cases started rising very soon after that. In April, though, in Vermont, people were still required to quarantine after traveling. The stay-at-home order did end in Vermont eventually, where non-essential places opened at 25% capacity in May. When North Dakota began the phased reopening, they actually reopened businesses and restaurants to 75% capacity, which is far greater than in Vermont. Also, their outdoor gathering max capacity of people was set at 500, whereas in Vermont, that was only capped to 150. Also in Vermont, they instituted a mask mandate executive order, and that obviously seemed to help the situation. Whereas in North Dakota, they didn't see a mask mandate until November of 2020, which was far later than in Vermont. Looking at September through October and November, we see that there were still differences in their approach. In Vermont, in the month of September, indoor gathering was a maximum of 75 people and outdoor was still 150. In North Dakota, there were no real travel restrictions. The situation was worsening, and actually, the governor increased the risk for more counties. North Dakotans traveling internationally were no longer required to self-quarantine for 14 days upon return. So cases were still rising very steadily. People weren't even quarantining. In October, bars and restaurants operate at 25% capacity, and high school sport teams also began meeting and beginning to practice. Currently, the situation is a lot better as vaccines have become available for both states. The vaccine is now available for people 16 and older, and they also reinstated the mask mandate and overruled the government. Now let's put this to the test.
We set up a hypothesis test comparing the difference of two proportions for North Dakota's number of cases in November and January. We did this because during November, North Dakota lifted the restrictions, and during January, vaccinations were available and the mask mandate was reinstated by the government. We set up this test to where the null hypothesis states that there isn't a difference between November and January, and the alternative is that there is a significant difference. We calculated it in RStudio using the prop test function, and we found that the p-value is equal to 2.2 times 10 to the negative 16th. This number is very close to 0, meaning that the p-value is significant, and that there is significant evidence suggesting that the proportion of cases is higher before vaccinations are available, and that vaccines actually help to reduce the proportion of cases in North Dakota. Moving on to New Jersey, this is a state with the highest proportion of deaths per 100,000 people. So let's go over what their policies were like. The first wave hit New Jersey pretty hard. So in the first 3 months, New Jersey closed their schools, had a stay-at-home order, and limited public activities to 10 people. And in June, they saw their numbers falling, so they immediately lifted the stay-at-home order and increased public activity capacity from 25% to 50%, and outdoor activities from 100 people to 250 people. After they lifted the restrictions, the numbers did stay low because COVID wasn't able to survive during high temperatures in the summertime. So they continued reopening recreational activities and maxing out their limit to 500 people. Since restrictions were very relaxed over the summer, COVID took to cooler temperatures and the cases started rising again. In response, New Jersey limited outdoor activities from 500 people to 150 people and indoor activities from 25 people to 10 people. Finally, in the new year, when vaccines were available, the numbers began falling, and New Jersey saw this and began lifting the regulations once more.
These are a list of our dataset sources, including the United States Census Bureau, healthdata.gov, and our world data.
In conclusion, we saw that Vermont was successfully able to maintain low proportions of cases and deaths with slight fluctuations and no drastic spikes. This was likely due to the government's strategic and gradual phased reopening, as well as quick responses to slight increases in cases. On the contrary, we saw that North Dakota tried to do a phased reopening too quickly with really drastic measures, such as really high max capacities, opening restaurants and bars to 75% really soon, and overall, just not using methods that were very safe and sustainable for everyone. North Dakota and New Jersey were also the two states with the highest proportion of cases and deaths, respectively. The drop in proportion of cases and deaths from February 2021 until now could coincide with the increase in people receiving vaccinations and distribution overall.